My name is Delia Voss, and I was 19 years old when I found out my parents had already sold a piece of land my grandfather left me. Not were planning to sell it. Had sold it. Signed, transferred, deposited. The money was already in an account I had no access to. Except there was one problem. The land was never theirs to sell. I know that sounds like something you'd read in a headline and scroll past. But I'm going to slow this down and tell you exactly how it happened, because the part that still keeps me up at night isn't the betrayal, it's how long the setup took. How many small moments I mistook for nothing. How many times I sat at a table where decisions were being made about my life and never even knew it. Before I tell you what I found in an envelope taped behind a kitchen cabinet, let me take you back 7 years to a man named Elwood Voss and a piece of land he called the quietest place he ever found. Hit like if you've ever had someone take something from you slowly enough that you almost didn't notice. Drop your city below, I love knowing where you're listening from. And if you're new here, subscribe, because this story doesn't end where you think it does. The backstory: Grandpa Elwood and the land. My grandfather, Elwood Voss, was not a wealthy man by most definitions. He didn't own stocks. He didn't have a financial advisor. He drove the same brown pickup truck for 19 years and resold his work boots twice before buying new ones. What he had was land. 11 acres in a place called Heron Flat, about 40 minutes east of the town where I grew up. Flat in the front, wooded in the back, with a creek running along the southern edge that flooded just enough in spring to make the grass grow thick and dark green all summer. He bought it in his 30s with money saved from 20 years of shift work at a paper mill. No mortgage. Cash. He told me that once, not as a brag, but as a lesson. He said, "Delia, the only thing they can't take from you is what you own clean." I was 11. I thought he was talking about the creek. He wasn't. Every summer from the time I was 8 until I was 15, I spent 2 weeks at Heron Flat. Not a vacation exactly. Elwood didn't do vacation. He did work that happened to be pleasant. We'd clear brush along the fence line in the morning. We'd fix whatever the winter had broken in the afternoon. In the evenings, we'd sit on the tailgate of that brown truck and watch the light change over the tree line, and he'd tell me things. Not advice exactly. More like observations he'd been saving up. He told me that land doesn't care who thinks they own it. It only responds to who shows up. He told me that the creek had been running before his grandfather was born and would be running long after everyone at his funeral was gone. He told me that some things are worth more than what you can sell them for, and the people who don't understand that will spend their whole lives confused about why they're not happy. I absorbed all of it the way kids absorb things, without knowing I was storing it, without knowing I'd need it. My grandfather never had much use for my father, Randall Voss. He didn't say that out loud, at least not to me, but I could feel it the way you feel temperature change before you see weather. When my dad showed up at Heron Flat, which wasn't often, Elwood got quieter. More deliberate. He chose his words the way he chose fence posts, only the ones that would hold. My dad, Randall, was a talker. A deal maker by personality if not always by result. He sold insurance for a regional company, and he was good at it, which meant he was good at making things sound more certain than they were. He had a way of walking into a room and taking up all the air without seeming aggressive. Just confident. Just sure. The kind of sure that makes other people feel like their doubts are the problem. He and my grandfather disagreed about most things, but they were careful around it. Family careful. The kind of careful that looks like peace but is actually just managed distance. My mother, Patti, loved Randall in the way some people love a project, with patience that had its limits and a belief that she could see what he was capable of better than he could. She was practical in small things and optimistic about large ones. She kept a budget in a spiral notebook. She clipped coupons. She also co-signed a personal loan without telling anyone, twice. My younger brother, Cal, was the easy one. Good-natured, not complicated, the kind of kid who made parents look competent. He got the praise. I got the logistics. That was just how it was. I'm not saying that bitterly, I'm saying it because it matters later. The child who is easy becomes the child who is sheltered. The child who is capable becomes the child who is expected to manage. When I was 13, Grandpa Elwood sat me down at the kitchen table at Heron Flat, the same table where I'd eaten approximately 40 bowls of oatmeal over the years, and told me something plainly. He said he was going to leave me the land. Not split between family, not held in the estate for others to sort out. To me. He said he'd already talked to a woman named Ruth Calloway who handled estates and property in the county, and that it was going to be done properly. He looked at me steadily when he said it, the way he looked at fence lines, checking for wobble. I want you to have it because you're the only one who ever asked about the creek, he said. Not the price of it. The creek. I didn't cry. I wasn't raised to cry at kitchen's tables. I said, I'll take care of it, Grandpa. He nodded. That was the whole conversation. I didn't tell my parents. I don't know if I understood then why I kept it quiet, but some part of me knew, the way animals know weather, that this information would change something in the house if I let it in. So I didn't. When the land became a number. Grandpa Elwood died when I was 16. Heart attack, fast, no warning. Tuesday afternoon in October, out by the fence line he'd been meaning to repair since August. The neighbor found him. His boots were still on. The funeral was on a Friday. Cold enough for coats, not cold enough to excuse the way certain people behaved. I sat in the front row and held a program with his photo on it, the one from his 70th birthday where he's squinting into the sun and looks faintly annoyed at whoever is holding the camera. That was Elwood. He didn't perform for photographs. He didn't perform for much of anything. At the reception afterward, my dad's brother, Uncle Terence, showed up for the first time in 4 years with a new haircut and a very interested expression. Terence was the kind of man who appeared at funerals and family reunions but not at hospital waiting rooms or moving days. He shook hands with everyone, laughed a little too easily, and at some point ended up in the corner of the room with my father, both of them with their backs to the crowd. I was 16 and I was grieving and I was also watching. I couldn't hear them. But I saw Randall pull out his phone and show Terence something on the screen. Terence nodded slowly, the way you nod when something confirms what you already hoped. My dad glanced up once, scanned the room, and put his phone away when he saw me looking. I went and got a plate of food I didn't eat and sat next to my grandmother, Elwood's wife, Marin, who was small and dry-eyed and holding a cup of tea she wasn't drinking either. He already arranged things, she said quietly, not looking at me. She wasn't talking to the room. She was talking to me. He arranged things years ago. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I didn't ask what she meant. I think I was afraid that if I asked out loud, something would change. So I just nodded and sat with her until people started leaving. 2 weeks after the funeral, my dad mentioned Heron Flat at dinner. Casually, the way he mentioned things he'd been thinking about for longer than he let on. Dad's property is going to need to be dealt with, he said. Taxes don't stop because someone dies. I know, I said. He looked at me like he'd forgotten I was in the room. Then he smiled, not unkind, just automatic. Don't worry about it, delicate adult stuff. I was 16. I was getting closer to 18 by the day. And I knew that the phrase adult stuff was doing a lot of work at that table. Over the next year, the conversations didn't stop. They just moved. Out of the dining room and into the car. Into the garage. Into the hushed space between my parents at night when they thought I was asleep and sound traveled through the vent in the hallway better than they realized. Terence's name came up more. Ruth Calloway's name came up once. My mother's voice went tight when it did. Randall, she said. If Elwood used an attorney, there's a process. There's always a process, Patti. And there's always a way through it. His voice had that insurance salesman's smoothness, the one that was supposed to make complications sound manageable. I lay in my bed in the dark and memorized that sentence. There's always a way through it. It meant he was already looking. At 17, I went to Heron Flat alone for the first time. My grandmother Marin had given me a key the previous Christmas, slipped into a card with no explanation, just the key on a small ring with a green plastic tab. I drove out on a Saturday in March, the road still edged with old snow, the creek running high and dark with snowmelt. I walked the whole property. All 11 acres. I followed the fence line the way Elwood had taught me, pressing my thumb into the posts to check for soft spots. 2 needed replacing. I made a note. I checked the creek crossing where the old boards had been laid as a makeshift bridge. Still solid. I walked back through the woods to the stone marker at the northeast corner that Elwood had shown me one summer, an old boundary marker, weathered but firm, half buried in tree roots. "This is the corner," he'd said, standing next to it. "You know where the corners are, you know what's yours." I stood at that corner in March and thought about what was mine. On the drive home, my phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize. Just a name and a message. "This is Ruth Calloway. I was your grandfather's attorney. When you're ready to talk, please call me. He asked me to reach out when you were close to 18. I pulled over on the shoulder of the county road, read it twice, and saved the number. I didn't tell anyone. When I got home, my dad was on the phone in the kitchen. I heard 2 words clearly before he noticed me and turned toward the window. 11 acres. I went upstairs. I sat on my bed. I thought about a man who resoled his boots twice because he understood the difference between something worn out and something worth repairing. My grandfather had planned something. I didn't know the shape of it yet. But I knew it existed. And I knew that whatever it was, I needed to find it before anyone else did. The attorney, what Ruth Calloway told me. I called Ruth Calloway on a Thursday evening in April, sitting in my car in the school parking lot after everyone else had gone home. I don't know why I chose that spot. Maybe because it was the one place in my daily life that didn't belong to anyone in my family. Neutral ground. Somewhere I could hear clearly. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice was unhurried, the kind of unhurried that comes from decades of delivering complicated information to people who aren't ready for it. She didn't open with condolences or small talk. She said, "Delia, I've been waiting for this call for about a year. I'm glad you made it. I want to know what my grandfather arranged," I said. "Then come see me. There are documents you need to see in person. Some of them require your signature, and none of this should happen over the phone." I drove to her office the following Saturday. I told my parents I was going to the library to work on a college application essay, which was partially true. I had a college application open on my laptop. I just wasn't working on it at Ruth Calloway's office. Her office was in a low brick building on the east side of town, shared with a tax preparer and a small insurance agency. The waiting room had wooden chairs and a lamp with a yellow shade and magazines that were 8 months out of date. It felt like a place where serious things happened without any drama about it. Ruth herself was in her mid-60s, compact and direct, with short gray hair and reading glasses she took on and off like punctuation. She shook my hand the way people shake hands when they mean it, firmly and briefly, and she gestured to the chair across from her desk without ceremony. She opened a folder. "Set it on the desk between us. Let me tell you what your grandfather did," she said. What he did was this. 7 years before he died, Elwood Voss had come to Ruth Calloway with a specific concern. He told her that he had 11 acres he intended to leave to his granddaughter Delia, and that he was worried his son Randall would find a way to intercept it. Not because he thought Randall was a criminal, Ruth was careful about that word, but because he knew Randall was a man who saw solutions where others saw obligations. And land, especially land with no mortgage and no liens, looked a lot like a solution to someone carrying debt. So Elwood did 2 things. The first thing was a transfer on death deed. A legal instrument that, upon his death, automatically transferred the title of the 11 acres at Heron Flat directly to me, Delia Voss, without going through probate. No estate process. No family vote. No period where the property sat in legal limbo waiting to be sorted. The moment Elwood died, the land became mine by operation of law. The deed had been recorded at the county land records office 3 years before his death. I stared at the document on Ruth's desk. My name was on the second line. The property description, the parcel number, the acreage, all of it. My name. The deed transferred automatically when he passed, Ruth said. The county recorder updated the title records within 60 days of receiving the death certificate. As of last December, Delia, you are the legal owner of those 11 acres. I own it already. You have owned it since December. My hands were very still in my lap. I was focusing on keeping them that way. The second thing Elwood did was leave a letter. Sealed, held by Ruth, to be given to me when I came in, which she had trusted I would do because, she said, Elwood told her I was the kind of person who showed up. I held the envelope but didn't open it. Not yet. Is my father aware of the deed? I asked. Ruth paused in the careful way of someone choosing accuracy over comfort. The deed is a public record. Anyone who searched the property title would find it. She let that sit for a moment. As of 6 weeks ago, someone pulled the title on the Heron Flat parcel from the county recorder's office. Do you know who? The request was made by a title company. I recognize their name. They primarily work with developers and real estate investors in this region. I thought about my father at the funeral reception, showing Terrence something on his phone. I thought about the 2 words I'd heard through the kitchen doorway. 11 acres. Someone hired a title company to search the property, I said. Ruth nodded once. And they would have found my name on the deed. They would have found the transfer on death deed recorded 3 years ago, yes. Whether they understood what it meant, or whether they disclosed that to whoever hired them, I can't say. I looked at the folder on the desk. At my name in black ink on a legal document my grandfather had quietly put in place while I was still learning to drive. What do I need to do? I asked. Ruth pulled a second document from the folder. There's one step remaining. You need to file an affidavit of survivorship with the county recorder. It's a short document that formally confirms you survived your grandfather and are therefore the living grantee on the deed. Once it's filed, the title record is complete. Clean. Unambiguous. No one can claim the property passed through the estate because it never did. When can we file it? She looked at me over her glasses. You turned 18 last month. We can file it tomorrow if you'd like. I would like that very much, I said. She almost smiled. Elwood said you'd say something like that. I drove home with the letter on the passenger seat, still sealed. I didn't open it until I was parked in our driveway with the engine off and the windows starting to fog from the cold. My family was inside. I could see the kitchen light on through the front window. My mom's silhouette moving past the sink. I opened the envelope carefully. 1 page. Blue ink. His handwriting, angular and deliberate, getting softer toward the bottom the way it always did when he'd been writing for a while. He said he knew this wouldn't be easy. He said he was sorry for that, not for what he'd done, but for the fact that it had to be done at all. He said he'd watched Randall his whole life and loved him and never been able to fix the particular hunger in him that made him reach for things that should have been left alone. He said Heron Flat had watched 4 generations of weather and wasn't interested in being anyone's exit strategy. He said, you know where the corners are, Delia. That means you know what's yours. Don't apologize for knowing it. The last line said, the creek runs regardless. Let it. I folded the letter. Put it in my jacket pocket. Sat in the cold car for another minute. Then I went inside and set the table for dinner like nothing had happened. Because for 2 more days, until that affidavit was filed and recorded, nothing had happened yet. And I had learned from my grandfather that timing was not impatience. Timing was respect for the moment when a thing becomes permanent. 2 days later, Ruth filed the affidavit. The title was complete. The land was mine. And somewhere across town, someone was about to find out that the deal they thought they were putting together was built on a foundation that didn't exist. what I didn't know was already in motion. Here's what I pieced together later. Not all at once. In fragments, the way you reconstruct something broken, matching edges until the shape becomes clear. My father Randall had been in contact with a man named Douglas Pell for approximately 8 months before I walked into Ruth Calloway's office. Douglas Pell was not a developer exactly. He was the kind of man who sat between developers and landowners, finding properties that weren't officially for sale and making introductions that benefited everyone except, occasionally, the person whose name was on the deed. Terence had introduced them. Of course Terence had introduced them. That was Terence's function in the family ecosystem. He appeared at moments of potential and disappeared before consequences arrived. Douglas Pell had a company called Pell Land Solutions, which was registered in the state as a real estate consulting firm. He had a website with a photo of himself standing in a field looking thoughtful, and a tagline that said "Turning Land into Legacy." I would later find this deeply ironic. Randall had told Douglas that he stood to inherit 11 acres in Heron Flat from his father's estate. He had said estate deliberately, I believe, because estate implied a process he could navigate, a pool of assets he had access to. He had not mentioned a transfer on death deed because either he didn't know about it or he chose not to know, and in terms of legal outcome, that distinction didn't matter much. Douglas Pell had connected Randall with a regional agricultural development company called Sycamore Land Group. They bought acreage on the edges of growing counties, held it, and eventually sold to larger developers or converted it for commercial farming operations. 11 flat acres with creek access and good southern exposure was exactly what they looked for. The number they agreed on informally was $240,000. Randall had not told my mother the full number. He'd told her they were exploring options. Patti, to her credit or her cost depending on how you look at it, had not asked enough questions. She'd been worried about the second loan she'd co-signed 18 months earlier, a personal loan Randall had taken to cover a gap in their finances that turned out to be wider than he'd described. $240,000 would have covered it entirely with room left over. I think she let herself want the number badly enough that she stopped interrogating the path to it. Terence was expecting a finder's fee. 10% of whatever Randall walked away with, an arrangement they'd apparently shaken hands on at the reception after my grandfather's funeral. The same reception where Elwood's body was not yet in the ground. I think about that sometimes. Terence walking away from the dessert table with a handshake and a plan. Elwood's photo still on the sign-in easel by the door. The closing date that Randall and Douglas Pell had discussed informally was contingent on a clean title search. That was the phrase in the paperwork. Contingent on clear and marketable title. Douglas Pell had hired the title company to pull the records. The title company had pulled the records. And the records showed a transfer on death deed recorded 3 years prior, naming Delia Voss as grantee. This was the moment the plan should have stopped. It didn't stop. What happened instead, and I know this because of what came out later in written correspondence that Ruth eventually obtained, was that Douglas Pell flagged the deed in a note to Randall and suggested it might be challengeable. He said, and I'm paraphrasing what Ruth read to me from the email, that transfer on death deeds were a relatively newer instrument in the state and that there was, in his non-legal opinion, an argument that the deed hadn't been properly executed. He recommended they proceed with the sale and handle any title dispute afterward, since the buyer had experience with clouded titles and access to legal resources. Randall wrote back one sentence. Let's move forward. That sentence would cost him more than he knew. Because what Douglas Pell had told him was not accurate. Transfer on death deeds in our state had been valid instruments for over a decade. Elwood's deed had been prepared by a licensed attorney, properly witnessed, properly notarized, and recorded with the county before his death. There was nothing challengeable about it. Either Douglas Pell didn't know that, which made him incompetent, or he did know it and said otherwise to keep his commission alive, which made him something else. I don't know which it was. I'm not sure it matters. What matters is that by the time I sat in Ruth Calloway's office on that Saturday morning, a purchase agreement had been drafted between Randall Voss and Sycamore Land Group for 11 acres he did not own. Earnest money had changed hands. Closing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. And my father had not said a single word to me about any of it. Not at dinner. Not in passing. Not in the careful voice my mother used when she was delivering news she knew I wouldn't like. Nothing. 6 weeks to closing and I was still setting the table and clearing the dishes and being told that certain things were adult stuff. I want to be precise about how that felt, because I don't want to overstate it and I don't want to minimize it either. It wasn't rage. Not then. It was something colder and more clarifying, like stepping outside on a morning when the temperature has dropped overnight and the air is so sharp it makes everything exact. I could see every edge. Every outline. The shape of what my father had decided about me, which was that I was not a person with a legal stake in this situation. I was a detail. A minor. A complication to be managed after the fact with whatever portion of $240,000 felt reasonable. I thought about the number he would have offered me. I thought about Terrence's handshake at the funeral. I thought about my mother's spiral notebook budget and the loans she'd quietly co-signed and the way she looked when she thought no one was watching her do the math. I thought about 11 acres and a creek that had been running before any of us were born. And I thought about a man in work boots who had spent 3 years quietly making sure that none of this could touch what he'd built. On the drive home from Ruth's office, I passed the turnoff for Heron Flat. I didn't take it. I just noted it the way you note something that belongs to you. Without urgency. Without performance. The affidavit of survivorship was filed the next morning. The title was complete. But I didn't know yet that the purchase agreement had already been signed. I didn't know about Douglas Pell or Sycamore Land Group or the earnest money or the 6-week closing window. I found all of that out 4 days later, sitting at my own kitchen table, when my father came home and told me, with the careful confidence of someone delivering good news, that he'd found a buyer for the family land and that everything was moving forward nicely. He called it the family land. I set down my fork. I looked at him across the table and I understood, with complete clarity, that the next few days were going to be the hardest of my life. Not because I didn't have ground to stand on. But because the person I was about to stand against was my father. And no legal document, however well prepared, makes that easy. Have you ever known something was coming and had to sit completely still anyway? Had to smile and pass the bread and say goodnight and go upstairs and lie in the dark waiting for the moment when you could finally move? Tell me in the comments. Because that is exactly where I was. And the worst part wasn't the waiting. The worst part was watching someone across the dinner table be so certain they had already won. The morning everything landed. My father told me about the sale on a Wednesday evening. Casual, between the main course and whatever was for dessert, the way he delivered most things he'd been sitting on for a while. He had a buyer for Grandpa's land. Good price, fair deal, reputable company. He said it would help the family get back on solid footing. He said Grandpa would have wanted that. He said Grandpa would have wanted that. I kept my face neutral. I said, "That's a lot to take in, Dad." He nodded like I'd said exactly the right thing. Patti refilled her water glass. Cal asked if there was any more chicken. The conversation moved on, and I sat in my chair and breathed carefully and thought about Ruth Calloway and a filed affidavit and a title record that told a completely different story than the one my father had just delivered over dinner. I texted Ruth that night. 2 sentences. They've told me about a sale. How do we handle the closing? She replied within the hour. Don't engage them further. Let me make some calls in the morning. Call me at 9. I set my phone face down on my nightstand. I stared at the ceiling. Down the hall, I could hear my parents talking in their room, voices low and satisfied, the sound of people who believe a hard chapter is almost over. They were right that a chapter was ending. They had the wrong chapter. I called Ruth at 9 the next morning from my car, parked 2 streets over from the house. She had already spoken to the county recorder's office to confirm the affidavit was fully processed and visible in the title record. She had also done something I hadn't asked her to do but was enormously grateful for. She had looked up the principals of Sycamore Land Group and placed a call to their legal department the previous evening, leaving a message identifying herself as attorney of record for the titled owner of the Heron Flat parcel and requesting that all closing activity be suspended pending a title review. Their attorney called her back at 8:30 that morning. By 9:15, when I was sitting in my car 2 streets from my house with the heat running and my hand steady in my lap, Ruth told me that Sycamore Land Group had suspended the closing. Their attorney had pulled the full title chain overnight. Transfer on death deed recorded 3 years prior. Affidavit of survivorship filed and recorded. Title held by Delia Voss, not Randall Voss, not the estate of Elwood Voss. The property had never been part of any probate proceeding because it had never needed to be. Their attorney's exact words to Ruth, which she read to me from her notes, were that the seller appeared to have no ownership interest in the subject property and that they would be consulting with their client regarding next steps. Next steps meant one thing. They were going to want their earnest money back. What was the earnest money? I asked Ruth. $15,000, she said. Paid by Sycamore to your father upon execution of the purchase agreement. $15,000 that my father had accepted for land he did not own. Ruth, is that fraud? She was quiet for a moment in the precise way of someone who knows the answer and is deciding how directly to say it. It is, at minimum, a material misrepresentation in a real estate transaction. Whether it rises to criminal fraud depends on what he knew and when he knew it. That's not my determination to make. But Sycamore's attorneys will make their own assessment. And they will want their money returned regardless. I thanked her. I sat in the car for another 10 minutes. A dog walker went past. A woman in a blue coat checked her mailbox. The neighborhood went about its morning, indifferent to the fact that my family's version of reality was about to be corrected. I drove home. I sat down at the kitchen table. The same table where he'd told me about the sale the night before. I wanted the geography to be the same. I wanted him to be standing in the same spot. Dad, I said. I need to tell you something about Heron Flat. He turned from the counter with his mug. Sure. What's up? Grandpa transferred the property to me before he died. It's called a transfer on death deed. It was recorded at the county 3 years ago. My name has been on the title since December. I filed the final affidavit with Ruth Calloway 2 days ago. The property is mine. It was never part of the estate. It was never yours to sell. The mug stopped halfway to his mouth. I watched him process it. Watched the sequence move across his face. Confusion first, then the particular kind of stillness that precedes a challenge, then something slower and harder to name. Recognition, maybe. Or the first cold touch of what had actually happened. That's not, he started. His voice was careful. That's not how it works, Delaware. His estate goes through probate. We're the heirs. Randall. Ruth's voice came through the phone I'd set on the table, face up, on speaker. I'd called her before I came inside and left the line open. She had agreed to it without hesitation. Elwood Voss executed a valid transfer on death deed 7 years ago. It was prepared by my office, properly witnessed and notarized, and recorded with the county recorder. Under state law, transfer on death deeds pass property outside of probate entirely. The property never entered the estate. Delia has been the legal owner since the date of Elwood's death. The title is complete and unencumbered as of 2 days ago. My father set his mug down on the counter without looking at it. It sat at the edge, slightly crooked. He didn't fix it. You went to a lawyer. His voice had gone very quiet. Grandpa went to a lawyer. 7 years ago. I just showed up to receive what he left me. The back door opened and my mother came in from the garage, still in her coat, grocery bag over one arm. She looked at my father's face, then at me, then at the phone on the table. What's happening? She said. Neither of us answered immediately. The refrigerator hummed. Ruth's line was quiet on the table between us. Randall, my mother said, her voice shifting into the register she used when she already suspected the answer. What did you do? It wasn't a question. It was an arrival. My father pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. He looked at the table. Not at me. Not at my mother. At the table, like it might offer something useful. I sold something that wasn't mine to sell, he said. His voice was flat and stripped of everything that usually furnished it. The confidence, the smoothness, the forward momentum. Just the sentence, plain and final. My mother sat down too. The grocery bag made a dull sound against the floor. She didn't say anything for a long time. I'm going to step off the line now, Ruth said quietly from the phone. Delia, call me this afternoon. The call ended. The three of us sat in the kitchen in the particular silence of people who have run out of the version of the story they were living in and haven't found the next one yet. Cal came downstairs in the middle of it, took one look at the room, poured himself a glass of orange juice, and went back upstairs without a word. He had good instincts that way. My mother spoke first, eventually. Her voice was controlled and very tired. How much did you take from them, Randall? 15,000, he said. Earnest money. She closed her eyes. They want it back. He said it like a statement, but it sounded like a question. Of course they want it back. She opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger exactly. Something past anger. The look of someone who has finally stopped being surprised. They paid you for land you didn't own. That's not a misunderstanding. That's fraud. I didn't know about the deed. Ruth's voice said there was a title search done before they signed, I said. The deed would have been visible. My father looked at me for the first time since I'd sat down. His eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I thought I could fix everything, he said. I thought if we could just get out from under the loans, get the house stable, start over clean. He stopped. With my grandfather's land. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. I want to tell you what I felt sitting there because I think it matters. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cold or vindicated or any of the things that might make a clean narrative. I felt the specific grief of watching someone you love reveal the full shape of what they chose, and understanding that they chose it knowing you existed. That they looked at what your grandfather left you and decided their need was larger than your inheritance. That they dressed it up in words like family and stability and starting over, but underneath all of it was a man who had decided his daughter was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be told the truth. That grief doesn't have a clean edge. It just sits there and asks you to carry it. I stood up. I picked up my phone from the table. Sycamore is going to want the 15,000 back, I said. I'd talk to an attorney before they contact you formally. I can ask Ruth for a referral if you need one. My father looked up. Why would you do that? Because he's still your grandfather too, I said. And I don't think he'd want me to leave you completely without a direction. Downstairs, I heard my mother's voice, low and steady, the voice she used when she had made a decision and was now implementing it. I heard my father's voice, shorter, quieter, the spaces between his words getting longer. I didn't listen to the content. I didn't need to. I texted Ruth. It's done. I told them. She replied in 2 minutes. How are you? I thought about it honestly. I typed back. Like someone who just walked through something and hasn't checked yet what they're carrying. She wrote, that's about right. Rest today. The rest is paperwork. I almost laughed. I set my phone down and looked out my window at the street below. The same street I'd grown up on. The same oak tree with the same broken branch I'd been looking at since I was 7. Everything exactly the same and completely different. My grandfather had said the creek runs regardless. I understood now that he wasn't talking about indifference. He was talking about continuity. About the things that keep moving not because they don't care but because they were built to last. I lay down on my bed and let the morning finish without me. The hardest part wasn't over. I knew that. There were calls coming, conversations I hadn't had yet with my mother, a financial reckoning my father was going to have to face, a family that was going to have to decide what it was made of when the version of itself it had been performing fell away. But the land was mine. Clean. Recorded. Permanent. And downstairs, for the first time since my grandfather died, nobody was making plans for it that didn't include me. What came after and what remains? The consequences arrived the way serious things do. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, each one following the last with the quiet logic of cause and effect. Sycamore Land Group sent a formal demand letter to my father within the week. $15,000, return of earnest money, plus documented costs incurred during the transaction process. Their attorney's letter was 4 pages long and used the phrase misrepresentation of ownership interest 3 times. My father hired a local attorney with the last of a savings account my mother didn't know he had. The irony of spending saved money on a lawyer to deal with the consequences of trying to take money he hadn't earned was not lost on anyone in the house. Douglas Pell, the man who had sat between my father and Sycamore and told Randall that the transfer on death deed might be challengeable, was named in a separate communication from Sycamore's legal team. His consulting fee, which had been paid in advance against the commission he expected, was also subject to recovery. I never met Douglas Pell. I know he existed because his name appeared in documents and because Terence, when everything unraveled, made a point of telling anyone who would listen that the whole thing had been Douglas's idea. Terence did what Terence always did. He found the exit before the ceiling came down. My father repaid the $15,000. It took him 3 months and it required selling a boat he'd owned since before I was born, a small fishing boat he kept in the garage under a tarp and took out maybe twice a year. He sold it to a man 2 towns over for $11,000 and made up the difference from a payment plan he arranged directly with Sycamore's attorney. The boat was gone on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, the garage looked different. Larger and emptier in the way spaces look when something that filled them for a long time is suddenly absent. No criminal charges were filed. Ruth told me later that Sycamore had evaluated the option and determined that civil recovery was sufficient and more efficient than a criminal proceeding. My father's attorney had apparently made a persuasive case that Randall had acted on bad information rather than deliberate malice. I don't know if I entirely believed that distinction. But I wasn't the one making the determination, and honestly, I was relieved. Not for him exactly. For the shape of what came after. A criminal charge would have closed certain doors permanently. What happened instead left doors shut but not locked, which felt closer to what my grandfather would have wanted. Terence called me once. 3 weeks after everything had settled. His voice had the particular texture of someone performing casualness badly. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings. He said family was family. He said Elwood would have wanted everyone taken care of. I let him finish. Then I said, Grandpa left specific instructions about who he wanted taken care of and how. I'm following them. That's all I'm doing. He started to say something else. I thanked him for calling and ended the conversation. He has not called since. My mother was the hardest. Not because she was cruel or dishonest in the way my father had been, but because she was someone I had believed in, and belief is more expensive to revise than anger. Anger is clean. Revision is slow and it costs something every time you do it. She came to my room 2 weeks after that morning in the kitchen. Knocked, which she didn't always do. Sat on the edge of my desk chair and held her hands in her lap and looked at me with an expression that had had time to settle into something honest. I didn't know he'd signed papers, she said. I want you to know that. I knew he was talking to people about the land. I knew he thought it could solve things. But I didn't know he'd already signed. I believe you, I said. And I meant it. But you didn't ask enough questions. She nodded once. That's true. You wanted the number badly enough that you didn't look at the path. She was quiet for a moment. Yes. That honesty cost her something. I could see it. And because it cost her something, I accepted it as real. We sat together for a while without talking, which was something we had not done in years. Maybe not since I was small. The room was quiet. Outside, a car passed. A dog barked twice and stopped. I'm going to keep the land, Mom. I want you to understand that's not changing. I know. She looked at her hands. Your grandfather was a careful man. He was. She looked up at me. He didn't trust your father. No. He loved him. That's different. Her eyes went bright for a moment, then steady again. She nodded. Stood up. Straightened the edge of my desk blotter without needing to. I'll let you get back to your evening, she said. She paused in the doorway. Delia. I'm sorry we made you fight for something that should have just been given to you. She left before I could answer. Which was probably for the best because I didn't have an answer ready. Only the feeling of something long held releasing just slightly, not gone, not resolved, but loosened enough to breathe around. I enrolled in the state university that fall. Environmental studies with a concentration in land conservation. The cabin at Heron Flat, which was actually a small equipment shed Elwood had converted years ago into a one-room space with a cot and a wood stove and a shelf of paperback novels, became my weekend place. I drove out every Saturday morning the way I had when I was 17, except now I drove as the owner. The difference in that was smaller than I expected and larger than I can explain. I replaced the 2 fence posts I'd noted in March. I repaired the creek crossing with new boards cut to the right width. I walked the property line in November with a clipboard and made a full condition report, the way Elwood had taught me, methodical and without sentiment. I found the stone corner marker at the northeast edge, still half buried in tree roots, still firm. I put my hand on it the way you put your hand on something to confirm it's real. Still there. Still exactly where it had always been. Nora, the neighbor whose property bordered the southern edge of Heron Flat, brought me a jar of preserves in October. She was in her 70s, weathered and unhurried, with the manner of someone who has outlasted most of the dramas they've witnessed. She handed me the jar and looked out at the creek and said, "Your grandfather used to say this land had patience. Said it had been waiting a long time for the right person." I held the jar. The creek moved past below us, low and clear in the fall light. "I think I know what he meant now," I said. She nodded like that was the expected answer and walked back to her property without further ceremony. Cal came out to Heron Flat once, in late November. He drove up unannounced on a Sunday afternoon, hands in his pockets, looking slightly uncertain in the way people look when they're not sure of their reception. I handed him a rake and put him to work clearing leaves from the drainage ditch along the north fence. We worked for 2 hours without talking about anything that had happened. At some point he said, "I didn't know what they were doing, Del." "I know," I said. "You were being protected from it." He thought about that. "Is that what it was?" "That's what it looked like from where I was standing." He was quiet for a while, raking. Then he said, "That doesn't seem fair." "No," I said. "It wasn't." We kept raking. The leaves were deep and wet and the work was satisfying in the way physical work is satisfying, because it produces something visible and the results stay where you put them. Before he left he stood by his car and looked back at the property. The tree line going gold in the late light. The creek glinting through the gap in the fence. "It's a good piece of land," he said. "Yeah," I said. "It is." He drove away. I went back inside and built a fire in the wood stove and sat with a book I wasn't really reading and listened to the creek. My father and I did not speak for 6 weeks after that morning in the kitchen. The silence was not something either of us declared. It was just the natural result of 2 people who had said the true things and needed time to decide what came next. He called on a Sunday evening in December. His voice had none of its usual forward momentum. It was just his voice, without the salesmanship, and I realized I had never heard it quite that plainly before. He said he was sorry. Not for being caught. He was specific about that in a way that told me he'd thought about the difference. He said he was sorry for deciding without telling me. For treating what my grandfather left me like a resource rather than a relationship. For assuming that his need was larger than my right. He said, I knew about you and Grandpa. I knew you were close. I told myself it didn't mean anything legal. But I knew it meant something. I sat with that for a moment. I know you knew, I said. He didn't try to reframe it. He just said, yeah. We talked for 40 minutes. Not about the land, not about the money, not about Sycamore or Douglas Pell or any of it. We talked about his father. About what Elwood had been like before I was born, before Randall was grown, when he was still the version of himself that existed before disappointment had time to accumulate. My father told me things about his own childhood at Heron Flat that I had never heard. About learning to fish at the creek crossing. About the summer Elwood built the equipment shed and let 12-year-old Randall hammer half the nails. About the way his father looked at that land, not like an asset, but like an answer to something. I think he loved it the way I never let myself, my father said. Because loving something that much felt too close to needing it. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. I thought about a man who resoled his boots twice because he understood the difference between worn out and worth repairing. About the way he'd stood at the northeast corner marker and told me that knowing where the corners are means knowing what's yours. About a letter written in blue ink that got softer toward the bottom because he'd been writing for a long time and his hand was tired. He had loved Heron Flat enough to plan for it. Enough to be quiet about the plan. Enough to wait 7 years to deliver it through a woman with reading glasses on a chain and a folder with my name on the second line. He had loved me enough to trust that I would show up. And I had. Not perfectly. Not without fear or shaking hands or nights spent staring at ceilings. But I had shown up on time and signed my name and kept the promise, and that turned out to be enough. There is a version of this story that ends with a lesson, something clean and transferable about protecting yourself legally or identifying people who mean you harm. I could give you that version. It wouldn't be dishonest. But it wouldn't be the whole thing either. The whole thing is this. My grandfather saw something in an 11-year-old standing at a creek who asked about the water instead of the acreage. He spent the next decade quietly making sure that the world, or at least 11 acres of it, would be available to that child when she needed it. He didn't announce it. He didn't use it as leverage. He just did it and trusted time to deliver it. I think about that when the days are hard. Not as a comfort exactly, but as an orientation. A way of knowing which direction to face. Some people plan their love forward. They put it in documents and envelopes and filed records at the county office. They trust attorneys and timestamps and the public record. They do the quiet work of making sure that what they built survives them in the hands of the person they chose. If someone has ever done that for you, quietly, without telling you, without needing credit for it, I hope you know it. I hope you find the envelope. I hope you make the call. I hope you show up. I'm at Heron Flat on a Saturday morning in early spring as I write this. The creek is running high from the snowmelt, dark and fast and completely indifferent to everything that happened over the last year. The fence posts I replaced are holding. The corner marker is exactly where it has always been. The wood stove is warm. The paperbacks on the shelf are the same ones that were there when I was 8 years old eating oatmeal and not knowing yet that this place would one day ask me to fight for it. I didn't win against my family. There is no winning when the people you're standing against are the people who were supposed to stand beside you. You don't come out of something like that whole. You come out changed, and then you spend a long time figuring out the difference between what was lost and what was shed. What I know is this. I kept a promise to a man who kept his word in blue ink in a desk drawer for 2 years waiting for me to find it. I stood at a kitchen table and said the true thing even though my hands were shaking. I filed the right paper at the right time and let the law do what the law was designed to do. And every Saturday morning I drive 40 minutes east on a county road that curves through bare fields and early green, and I park in the gravel and walk up to a one-room shed with a wood stove and a cot, and I unlock the door with the key my grandmother put on a small ring with a green plastic tab, and I sit down and I listen to the creek. It runs regardless. That's what he said. That's what he meant. Not that nothing matters. That some things are built to last beyond the worst of what people do to each other. That if you know where the corners are, you know what's yours. That patience isn't weakness. It's timing. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply show up on time to receive what someone who loved you spent years quietly putting in place. That's my story. If it stayed with you, if it made you think about someone who protected you quietly or something worth protecting, I want to hear about it in the comments. I read every one. And if you're holding on to something that belongs to you, something someone else has decided they have a right to simply because you're young or quiet or because they assumed you wouldn't know better, I hope this reminded you to make the call. Find the attorney. File the paper. Show up. Your grandfather, or whoever your version of him is, already did the hard part. All you have to do is be there to receive it. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. And share this with someone who needs to hear it today.